On the morning of August 25, 2026, the world woke up to news it had spent 60 years hoping it would never hear. Dolly Parton was gone. She was 80 years old. She died in Nashville, the city that had been her home for more than half of her life, surrounded by the people she loved most. And for the first few hours, that was almost everything the public was told. Peacefully. At a hospital. No cause given. Just a family's grief, delivered by her nephew Brian Seaver in a video that the entire world seemed to watch at the same moment. The tributes came in a flood that felt less like a news cycle and more like a national exhale. The White House lowered the flag. The Empire State Building glowed pink 4-9 to 5. Fans left flowers at her star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Dollywood closed its gates, then reopened them the next day with a message that was pure Dolly: the show must go on. Reba McEntire called her "my buddy Dolly." Sally Field said that if there are truly angels on earth, we had just lost one. The world did what the world does when it loses someone it genuinely believed it would always have. The details of her goodbye were as carefully managed as everything else. Her funeral would be small and private, per her wishes, for immediate family. In lieu of flowers, the family asked fans to donate to the Imagination Library, the charity that had put hundreds of millions of books into children's hands. Even in death, the message was the same one she'd sent her whole life: the show goes on, and the work continues. But underneath all of that grief, there was a question that nobody could answer yet. A question that would only get louder as the hours passed. How did she die? For a full day, the answer was almost nothing. The family announced that she had passed peacefully, surrounded by loved ones. No cause given. And that silence, that deliberate, unusual silence, is where this story really begins. Because the statement that finally came did not just answer the question. It rewrote the story she had been telling for an entire year. After bravely facing a brief battle with cancer, her representatives confirmed, Dolly departed her earthly life today at the Vanderbilt-Ingram Cancer Center surrounded by loved ones. Cancer. The word she had never once said out loud in public. Not in a year of health updates. Not in a year of videos and interviews. Not once. And here is the part that makes this story so strange, and so very Dolly. The story she told the public in the last year of her life was true. Almost every word of it checks out. And it was still, in the most important way, a version of the truth that was built to hide the one word that mattered most. So here is the question this video exists to answer. If the real cause of Dolly Parton's death was cancer, a diagnosis her own family has now confirmed, then what, exactly, was she telling us all that year? And why did she tell it the way she did? To understand that, you have to go back to where the concealment actually begins. And it begins earlier than most people realize. In September 2025, Parton announced that she was postponing a planned Las Vegas residency. Her own words were careful in a way that, in hindsight, reads less like vagueness and more like precision. She said she was dealing with health challenges. She said her doctors had told her she needed a few procedures. Now, notice what that sentence does. It is not a lie. Cancer treatment genuinely does involve procedures. But the sentence is engineered so that anyone hearing it pictures something routine. Something manageable. Something an 80-year-old woman deals with and moves past. Nobody hearing that sentence in September 2025 would have guessed that the word underneath it was cancer. This is the first move in a pattern that would repeat, with almost mechanical consistency, for the next 11 months. Every statement true. Every statement incomplete. Every statement built to keep the audience's picture of Dolly Parton exactly where she wanted it to be. A month later, in October, the carefully managed version of the story nearly slipped out of her control. Her sister, frightened, speaking without the same practiced caution, publicly asked fans to pray for Dolly, saying she hadn't been feeling her best. It was a family member speaking from the heart, and it registered immediately as a risk. Because here was someone who wasn't managing a narrative. Here was someone who was simply scared for her sister, and said so in public the way anyone would. The very next day, Dolly released her own video to calm the alarm. She told fans she was doing okay. That she had some problems to deal with. That she was undergoing a few treatments. Look at that sentence again, now that you know what she knew and they didn't. She wasn't lying about how she felt in that moment. She was managing the gap between what her sister's fear had revealed and what she was willing to let the public understand. And notice the shape of her response. It wasn't a denial. It was a redirection. She didn't say there's nothing wrong. She said there's something, and I'm handling it, and here is the version of it you're allowed to have. That is not the response of someone hiding a secret. It's the response of someone running a story. By March 2026, at the seasonal opening of Dollywood, the theme park she had built in her own Smoky Mountain backyard, now celebrating its 40th season, the language shifted towards something heavier. She told the crowd she had been worn down, worn out. And she connected it, explicitly, to grief. Grief over her husband Carl Dean, who had died the previous spring after nearly 6 decades of marriage. She said she was working to rebuild herself spiritually, emotionally, and physically. If you didn't know what was coming, that reads as an aging woman processing loss. If you do know what was coming, then one word in that sentence is doing a lot more work than anyone in that crowd understood at the time. Physically. Because grief doesn't usually come with a plan to rebuild your body. Grief explains the emotional weight. It explains the exhaustion. But it doesn't explain the word physically unless there was something physical, specific, and serious underneath it that she wasn't naming. Then, in May 2026, she gave her most specific public disclosure. And it's worth sitting with exactly how specific it was, because it tells you precisely how much truth she was willing to hand over and exactly where the boundaries sat. She canceled another Las Vegas show and named kidney stones. She described them, in her own words, as a condition so persistent that doctors had dug more stones out of her in a year than a rock quarry back home in Tennessee. She went further. She said her immune system and her digestive system had been out of whack for the past 3 years, and that she and her doctors were working hard to rebuild and strengthen both. She said she was responding really well to medications and treatments. That she was improving every day. That the treatments made her a little bit swimmy-headed. And that her doctors assured her that everything she had was treatable. That timeline matters enormously now. 3 years reaches back well before any public health language at all. Back before Carl's death. Back before the September postponement. Back before any of it. Whatever was actually happening inside her body had been developing quietly for years before she ever gave the public a single word about it. And here is the detail that should stop you cold. She said everything she had was treatable. That was the message she chose to leave her fans with. Not I'm sick. Not I'm scared. Not this is serious. Treatable. The word that lets an audience breathe again. The word that keeps the story manageable. In the weeks before she died, the pattern held. She missed a major Dollywood appearance, and her team explained it the same way they had explained everything else. Her doctor had advised against travel. She'd been feeling dizzy. She'd been dealing with dehydration. Every individual sentence checks out. The symptoms were real. The explanation was incomplete. And then, 4 days before her death, she gave one final interview to People magazine on Friday, August 21st. And in it, she came closer than she ever had to telling the truth without ever using the word. I am dealing with some health issues that I just didn't pay attention to when I was watching over Carl, she said. She talked about the 24/7 world of social media, how everything gets magnified in ways it wasn't years ago. She said she was still healing and still working. She talked about avatar performances her team was developing, about all the things she still wanted to achieve, about keeping on working as long as she could. She told people she still had so many things she wanted to see come to life. And she said it the way she'd said everything for a year, with warmth, with plans, with forward motion. There was no hint of an ending in it. That was the point. Read that interview now, knowing what we know. She wasn't performing wellness she didn't feel. She was performing something far more specific, the careful incompleteness she had apparently decided, at some point after her diagnosis, was the only honest way she could keep working, keep being Dolly Parton, without turning every public appearance into a referendum on how much time she had left. She died 4 days later. At the Vanderbilt-Ingram Cancer Center. Surrounded by loved ones. 17 months after losing the husband she had spent nearly 60 years with. So here is the real cause of Dolly Parton's death, confirmed by her own family and representatives: cancer. The specific type has not been disclosed, and as of this reporting, still hasn't been. Her family called it a brief battle. And that word brief deserves scrutiny rather than acceptance, because it sits awkwardly against everything else in the timeline. If the immune and digestive issues she described in May 2026 trace back 3 years, and if the September 2025 procedures were already connected to this same diagnosis, then brief is doing very specific, very deliberate work in that family statement. It's possible the disease itself progressed quickly, even after a long period of related symptoms. Cancers are frequently diagnosed only once they've reached an advanced stage. An aggressive cancer discovered late can absolutely constitute a brief battle, even after years of preceding, less specific health trouble. It's also possible that brief is simply the word a grieving family reaches for when they want the public to understand the ending without walking through the whole of it. Both readings are honest. Neither can be confirmed from what's public right now. And that ambiguity is itself the point. Because the same careful incompleteness that defined her public statements for a year also defines the family's statement about her death. The instinct didn't end when she did. It was carried through to the very last sentence the public would ever hear about her. It's worth being honest about the limits of what we know, because this story has a way of filling its own gaps with speculation. We know she died of cancer. We know the type has not been disclosed. We know she was treated at Vanderbilt-Ingram, one of the country's leading cancer centers. We know her family described the final battle as brief. We know she spent the last year of her life describing real symptoms: kidney stones, dizziness, dehydration, immune and digestive problems, exhaustion, grief, without ever connecting them to the disease underneath. What we don't know is when the diagnosis came. Whether the September 2025 procedures were the beginning of treatment, or whether she had already been living with the disease for years before that. Whether the 3 years she mentioned in May 2026 referred to the disease itself, or to the cascade of related problems it caused. Whether the final decline was genuinely fast, or whether brief is a family's way of protecting her memory from a longer, harder story. None of that can be settled from the public record. And that uncertainty is not a failure of reporting. It's the last and most complete example of the thing she did best, deciding exactly how much of herself the world was allowed to see. Which brings us to the question that matters more than the timeline. Why did she do it this way? Because the pattern is remarkably consistent with who she had been for 60 years. Dolly Parton built an entire public identity around control. Control of her image. Control of her music publishing. At a time when almost nobody in Nashville kept ownership of their own songs, she wrote thousands of songs, including Jolene and 9 to 5, and she kept them. Control of her business empire. She built Dollywood on her own terms, in her own hometown region, rather than letting an entertainment conglomerate absorb her name. She turned her philanthropy into one of the most quietly effective machines in American culture, an imagination library that puts hundreds of millions of books into children's hands, a $1 million donation to COVID research that helped seed the Moderna vaccine. Control, above all, of exactly what the audience got to see of her, and when. She was, by every account of the people who worked with her, one of the most quietly strategic operators the entertainment industry ever produced. wrapped inside a persona so warm and unthreatening that almost nobody clocked the discipline underneath it. The rhinestones, the jokes, the self-deprecation, all of it real, and all of it also a kind of armor. Managing a cancer diagnosis the same way she managed everything else in her public life, in careful, incomplete, entirely truthful pieces, isn't really an aberration. It's the same instinct she'd been running for 6 decades, applied one final time to the hardest material she'd ever had to work with. There's a version of this story where that instinct reads as troubling. A woman keeping her own fans in the dark about something they arguably had some claim to know, given how much of her identity she'd built on seeming to let them in. There's another version where it reads as exactly the kind of dignity she had earned the right to. She spent a year telling her fans real, true things about her body, kidney stones, dizziness, grief, exhaustion, while protecting the one piece of information that would have turned her final months into a death watch instead of a life she was still actively living. Touring when she could. Working. Showing up to open a theme park ride whenever her body would let her. She chose, again and again, to give her audience updates rather than headlines. That's a distinction worth taking seriously, rather than reducing to a simple story about a secret finally getting out. Because a death watch is a very specific kind of cruelty, even when it's born of love. It turns a person into a countdown. It makes every appearance a diagnosis. Dolly Parton spent 60 years making sure nobody ever saw her as a countdown. And she was not going to let the last year of her life become one. None of this is to say that concealment was right, or that fans who feel hurt by it are wrong to feel that way. It's only to say that the choice was hers to make, and that she made it the way she made every other choice of her public life, deliberately, warmly, and completely on her own terms. Go back to her sister's plea in October 2025. The one moment the carefully managed story nearly cracked open early. Her sister wasn't managing anything. She was simply frightened for her sister, and said so in public the way anyone would. And Dolly's response the next day, calm, reassuring, slightly amused at the alarm, was the exact same instinct she applied for the next 10 months. Not a denial. A redirection. Now you know what she knew, standing in front of that camera. She wasn't performing wellness she didn't feel. She was performing the specific, careful incompleteness she had decided was the only honest way to keep being Dolly Parton for as long as her body would let her. She died surrounded by loved ones, at a cancer center in the city that had been her home for most of her adult life, 17 months after losing the husband she'd spent nearly 60 years with. Her family called it brief. The public record, pieced together from her own year of careful language, suggests it was anything but brief underneath the surface, even if the final stretch genuinely was. The real cause of Dolly Parton's death, now that the word has finally been said out loud, doesn't actually change the story she was telling all along. It just gives you the one piece she'd been quietly leaving out of a story that, in every other respect, she told exactly as honestly as she told every story for 60 years. She just chose, one last time, which parts belonged to her. And which parts belonged to everyone else.